ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Good morning. First, on behalf of the state of Texas, citizens of Dallas County, our duly elected District Attorney, Ms. Faith Johnson, our entire office with the Dallas County District Attorney's Office, we say thank you. We thank you for the time and the effort that you put into this case so far. But more importantly, on behalf of Maximus Everett, Vaughn Edwards, parents of Jordan Edwards, Adele, Charmaine, that entire family, I tell you thank you. You've sat here the last week, couple days, listening to a bunch of evidence in this case, and we've been watching you. We're very intent on everything coming off of that witness stand, and we just tell you thank you for everything that you've done so far in this case. We respect and we acknowledge the fact that police officers have a very dangerous and difficult job to do. We here at the DA's office, we work with these officers day in and day out. We acknowledge, we respect everything that they do to protect our communities. They go out, they sacrifice, they put their lives on the line to protect us and to keep us safe, to protect and to serve. But keep in mind that is their duty, to protect and to serve. And when we have police officers like the defendant in this case, Ray Oliver, who go out and they hurt our citizens, that's where it stops. That's where it must stop. And you, as the jury in these cases today, have a say in stopping defendants like Ray Oliver. When they start hurting our citizens on our streets, 15, 16-year-old young men coming from a party, doing nothing wrong, that's when you have to hold them accountable. Because at the end of the day, while we do respect, we understand, we acknowledge the jobs that police officers do day in and day out, the bottom line is they have to follow the law just like everybody else. Just like you and I. So let's talk about the law. The judge just read to you charges in this case. Obviously, the defendant is facing 3 charges. 2 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon by a public servant against Vidal Allen, the driver of that 2004 Impala, Maximus Everett, the rear right passenger in that 2004 Impala, and also, obviously, the murder charge for Jordan Edwards, the front passenger in that vehicle. So let's start with 2 aggravated assaults. A person commits the offense of aggravated assault by a public servant if he intentionally or knowingly threatens another with imminent bodily injury, and while doing so, he uses or exhibits a deadly weapon during the commission of the assault, and is a public servant acting under the color of his office or employment. Now, as it pertains to the actions of this defendant and the results of his actions, that's pretty much uncontroverted, undisputed. You know, based upon all the evidence that you've heard in this case, this defendant, Roy Oliver, while on duty, Balls Springs police officer with his partner, Officer Gross, with that AR-15, shot 5 times into this 2004 Chevrolet Impala. As obviously known, at this point, the Jordan was struck and killed instantly. You also know from the testimony of the individuals inside that car, Maximus, Vidal, that they were afraid for their lives. They were afraid for their lives when this defendant took that rifle and he fired those 5 shots into that car. By the grace of God, they were not struck. Moving on to the murder charge. A person commits murder if he intentionally or knowingly causes the death of an individual, or if he intends to cause serious bodily injury and he commits an act that is clearly dangerous to human life and causes the death of an individual. Obviously, again, you know in this case that Jordan Edwards, unfortunately, was struck and killed by the defendant, Roy Oliver. Keep in mind, you can go back when you review the evidence in this case and you review the charge. You don't have to be unanimous as it pertains to which one of those ways that we have proven it to you. Okay, 6 of you can go back there and say, based upon the evidence, I believe that the defendant intended to cause the death of Jordan. Okay, 6 of you can go back there and decide, I believe that the defendant intended to cause serious bodily injury to Jordan, and he caused his death. Okay? As long as each of you believe one of those beyond a reasonable doubt, the defendant is guilty. Now we'll talk about those justifications here in a little bit. I'll get to those. Keep in mind there's also a transferred intent provision in your charge. What that essentially means is, if you believe that the defendant, Roy Oliver, either intended to cause the death of Vidal Allen, the driver of that car, or intended to cause him serious bodily injury or death, okay, that intent transfers to Jordan. So you may be sitting there thinking, when you go back over the evidence, I don't necessarily believe that the defendant intended to cause the death or even hurt Jordan. But I do believe that based upon the evidence that he intended to either cause the death of or cause serious bodily injury to the driver, Vidal Allen. I would ask you to go back and listen and think about the testimony that you heard from the stand from the defendant, Roy Oliver. He told you what his intent was. He told you that he intended to shoot and either kill or seriously injure Vidal Allen because at that point in time, that car was a threat to his partner, Officer Tyler Gross. And again, we'll get to the merits of his justifications, but that's what he told you. Okay? So there is no doubt, there is no reasonable doubt what his intent was as it pertains to his actions. He intended to cause the death or serious bodily injury to Vidal Allen. Again, if you don't believe that applies to Jordan, it still applies to Jordan because of that transferred intent provision. Okay? So let's go to his justification. I'm sorry, let me address manslaughter really quickly. The state would submit to you that it is proven to you beyond a reasonable doubt that this defendant is guilty of murder. However, in the event that you find that the state has not proven that to you, then you go on to the lesser offense of manslaughter. Manslaughter is recklessly causing the death of an individual. Recklessness is defined in our law as you are aware of but consciously disregards a substantial and unjustifiable risk that the result will occur. In this particular case, obviously the death of Jordan. And that risk must be of such a nature and degree that its disregard constitutes a gross deviation from the standard of care that an ordinary person would exercise under all circumstances as viewed from the actor's standpoint. Reasonable. What is reasonable? A reasonable belief means a belief that will be held by an ordinary and prudent person in the same circumstances as the defendant. So let's talk about the defendant's reasonableness. This defendant got on this stand and told you that he had to use deadly force in this case because from his standpoint, he believed that this 2004 Chevrolet Impala driven by Vidal Allen was going to strike and hurt his partner, Officer Gross. Well, you know, based upon the evidence in this case, that was not a reasonable belief by this defendant, and that's for several reasons. First of all, I would submit to you that was not a reasonable decision based, first of all, surely from what you saw with your own eyes. You saw the body camera videos from both Officer Gross and Officer Oliver. And you clearly saw on those videos that vehicle was at no time in threat to Officer Gross. You saw as the officers proceeded down Barron onto Shepherd that vehicle was backing very slowly onto that road. You heard the testimony of the kids from that car, specifically the Dow who was driving that car, operating that motor vehicle. He stated that they heard those gunshots. He saw a light on the road coming towards him, but he did not realize at that point in time that that was a police officer. He was afraid, he was frightened, and he was trying to get out there. Now granted, looking back, the Dow should have stopped the car. But you can understand the circumstances that he was in. 16-year-old kid, he's responsible for his younger brothers, his friends. He was trying to get out of there. At no point in time, and he told you that, as well as those other kids and several other witnesses, at no point in time was he trying to strike either of those officers with that vehicle, specifically Officer Gross. The second reason why that justification fails is because Officer Gross, he sat here in the stand as well under oath, and he told you exactly what he felt that day. He told you that he was never in fear, not for 1 second, in fear of being struck by that vehicle. As a matter of fact, he told you himself, and you can see on the video, that he was actually going towards that vehicle. He struck the vehicle to get it to stop. He also testified to you at no point in time that he fired his weapon. His defense also fails, this defense of the third person, because you have multiple witnesses who were eyewitnesses to the shooting. Jeremy Seaton, Eric Knight, Reginald Mickens, who tells you they had a front row seat for this incident. Again, at no point in time was this vehicle a threat to Officer Gross. In fact, the vehicle proceeded southbound in the northbound lanes trying to avoid these officers. If this vehicle was trying to hit these officers, that vehicle would have hit those officers. It would have not taken attempts, evasive maneuvers to try to go around and avoid these officers. So specifically, what are we talking about? Defense of the third person. A person is justified in using force or deadly force against another to protect the third person if, under the circumstances that the person reasonably believes them to be, the person would be justified in using force or deadly force to protect himself against the unlawful force or unlawful deadly force he reasonably believes to be threatening the third person he seeks to protect, and the person he reasonably believes that his intervention is immediately necessary to protect the third person. Going on to the use of deadly force. The person is justified in using deadly force against another if he would be justified in using force against the other, and when to the degree he reasonably believes that the deadly force is immediately necessary to protect himself against the other's use or attempted use of unlawful deadly force. Again, reasonably believes, immediately necessary. These are the things that the state legislature decides to put in this law because of the finality of the use of deadly force. The risk of taking innocent human life, like that of 15-year-old Jordan Edwards. You go back there and you read this law again and you ask yourself, based upon the evidence that you heard in this case, was it immediately necessary for the defendant, Roy Oliver, to use deadly force against these kids in this car? Were his actions reasonable based upon what he saw out there that night on April 29, 2017? The state would submit to you that it was not. You may recall the testimony of their expert who stated that in the scooter loop, it takes a second to a second and a half or more to make the decisions to both start and stop shooting, if you recall it. But you may also recall from the evidence that these 5 shots took less than 1 second. Now, if you apply that reasoning to the facts in this case, you would see that that math does not add up. There would have been more shots based upon what that expert told you on these 15 minutes. Thank you, Ron. Jordan Edwards was an innocent 15-year-old kid. Bright student, excellent athlete, had friends and family that loved him. He will not have the opportunity to play football again. He will not have the opportunity to go to college, get an education, and to make something of himself. His friends, his family, his parents will never have the opportunity to see him smile again or to give him a hug because of the unreasonable actions of this defendant were out. When you go back to deliberate on this case, we're going to ask that you find the defendant Raul guilty on all of these counts. 2 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon by a public servant, as well as the murder of Jordan Edwards. And we're going to ask you to do that not because the defendant was a police officer, but because this defendant was an individual who broke the law, who took the life of an innocent 15-year-old kid. By the grace of God, these young men are sitting here today. Maximus, Maxwell, Kevon, Vidal was fortunate to see this day and go on to go to college. I'm going to ask you to find them guilty. And let me just throw in this before I take my seat. Even if you do find that the defendant was justified in using deadly force because of the way that Vidal was operating that motor vehicle, I will submit to you that he was not. But even if you so find that, there's a provision in your charge, innocent third-person construction in the states. Even though an actor is justified in using deadly force against another, if in doing so he recklessly kills an innocent third person, the justification afforded by the law in a prosecution for the reckless killing of an innocent person is unavailable. Even if you so find, based upon all the evidence in this case, which I would submit to you does not show that he was justified in using deadly force to protect Officer Gross, even if you find that, there's no excuse, there's no justification for Raul in the killing of Jordan Edwards. Because even though he was justified in using deadly force against Vidal, you may find that disappears. That defense, that justification goes away in the manner in which he killed Jordan. Again, we thank you for the time and attention that you paid so far. We look forward to your verdict, and we ask that you find him guilty on all counts. Thank you.